Hi, everybody. This is Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and also the Association for Narcissistic Personality Disorder and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment. That's a mouthful. Thanks for joining me. This has been a series on some topics related to correcting some theory out there on narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. So the first video in this series is called Intro, What I Meant. So if you are watching this for the first time, I direct you there so that you'll know the reason behind these videos. So in the last video, before I get to that, I watched back the videos, a couple of the videos, and so I can tell by the cadence of my words in some of those videos that I'm having a concentration issue related to my autoimmune disorder. So I apologize. It irritated me, so I'm sure it's irritating to other people. But I don't have the time or energy to redo those. So thank you for grace and mercy in those videos because, I struggle with it, and I probably should do these videos earlier in the day before I'm tired. So at the end of one of those very distracting videos, I talked about the issue about codependency and the studies of the personality traits of the women and what we found out in 3 different research projects over 10 years. And we called those personality trait elevations in the survivors, we nicknamed them super traits. And I directed you to the website that has a free 3-part audio that explains all of the trait elevations and the facets that go with it. And I also said about 1/3 of this book, Women Who Love Psychopaths, is devoted to going in real depth. So at the end of that video, I said I was going to talk about kind of a myth buster. That's how I'm seeing this series, is confronting some of the stuff I hear out there that I don't think is on track with what we truly do know. And one of the myths was this issue about intuition and trusting your gut. And I was mentioned that I was going to utilize this recording to talk about that. But in thinking about it, I really can't, because what's connected to the inconsistent intuition in survivors is actually one of the personality trait elevations that I did not describe in the last video. So we're going to postpone the inconsistent intuition and talk a little bit about the trait elevations, the super traits of personality, as we called them. And again, for more detail, go to the book or listen to the 3-part series on our website, which is saferelationshipsmagazine.com, and it's right on the homepage on the right-hand side. So without further ado, so in the last video, I talked about why I went searching for this over the decades of work with these survivors. And that's because the way that other people were describing them and the kinds of things they were attempting to do in therapy with them or sending them to codependency groups did not mesh, in my view, of what I was seeing in the survivors. And so over the years, I just, have slowly, methodically been working on digging into this deeper. And we knocked on the door of Purdue University, who helped us do a really big study of 600 survivors. And what came out of that was consistently what we saw in personality traits in survivors. And the reason this is important is because I think the next piece of work for us is really looking at how much this is related to direct targeting. I know we say that, and I think we need to look into that deeper and not just assume that. So if that's true, if we dig in and find some, strong correlations beyond assumptions that these traits are knowingly targeted and not just vicariously, which I don't think is the case, it will have a lot of application and prevention. So if we know that the type of the personality type that survivors have, that cluster Bs and psychopaths consistently target, then we know a couple of things. We know where to put our energy into prevention with people that have these personality types. And it also is a factor in treatment because, to date, the stuff I see out there about supposedly what is prevention for this, I don't think is prevention. And I think the real prevention is working with the survivor's personality, and that they have to really understand this, because you can't guard what you don't understand. And if you're sitting around guarding this trait of empathy and you think you're an empath, you're missing the 13 other facets that go along with that, and then the other trait and the 14 facets. So you've covered 1 in 28 facets for protection or awareness, that you're aware that you have hyperempathy, which is not the totality of being an empath. But we've got to bring some real science to this thing, that instead of not having a solution for prevention with this, that we can use what we have found in a way to identify the personality types that are most likely to get targeted, and then teach survivors what those traits look like, sound like, what they do in relationships, what they do with incoming red flag information. It has everything to do with that, everything to do with how information is bypassed because of these personality traits, how cognitive dissonance is enhanced and more severe in people who have these personality trait elevations. It has a lot to do with what we should be doing in prevention and treatment. And so to me, this is the whole deal. This is the whole enchilada that we have uncovered in this information about the super traits. So Hold up. All right. So everybody has a personality, and personality impacts how we think, feel, relate, and behave. And not just in personality disorders, in every personality. If we think about personality disorders, we can think about how that disordered personality, how they think is different, how they feel, how think, feel, relate, and behave. So, but everybody has a personality. And so our personalities are impacted and made up of certain consistent traits that impact how we think, feel, relate, and behave. So in those traits that everybody has, and you can go look at, it's called the 5-factor model or the Big 5, and it breaks down the 5 personality traits that everybody has. And then you take those traits and you see them on a bell curve. And usually either end of the bell curve indicates pathology. So in those traits, for instance, we know with psychopaths or narcissists, they have too much of some traits and not enough of other traits. And that sort of indicates pathology. But in between both ends of that is the whole spectrum of the bell curve, where we could have all sorts of different amounts of these traits. And so it just hadn't been that in the past anyone bothered to use a personality assessment tool on survivors of psychopathic and narcissistic relationships. So the Big 5 or the 5-factor model has been used a lot in personality disorders. We know exactly what they look like on the bell curve and in the results of this assessment. What hadn't been looked at is you guys, and they have utilized the 5-factor, for instance, with domestic violence populations. And if you remember from the last video that I talked about how I did not think that a lot of the survivors of this were similar in their personality profile as more traditional domestic violence survivors. And lo and behold, in this research, the 5-factor, how domestic violence survivors' personality showed on this assessment was very different than yours. And it sort of supported, you know, my belief that we're dealing with a different subset of violence victims, or not even violence all the time, but victimization survivors, that there's another subset. All survivors are not the same. And a lot of you guys were trying to be treated in treatment as if you had the same personality as domestic violence. And what we found is that's not true. So all of that to say that we all have a personality, and the way that my history in terms of training has been in personality science, because in the beginning of my practice and work, I worked in a personality disorder clinic. I flew all over the United States getting the latest, greatest, best training, up-to-date training in personality disorders. And in the beginning, we attempted to treat personality disorders and psychopathy and the partners of, and then we switched over just to the partners. But my training, the majority of the way I think is in personality, because I spent so much of my training in that, and so much of the therapy that had to do with personality. So that's what made me begin to think about the women's personality. Since I was not finding answers anywhere else, I went back to what I know. I went back to my training. And so in the results of this Purdue research with the Institute was 2 major trait elevations. There were some elevations and some other things, but what really stood out that was noteworthy, that was a little bit past the bell curve of safety, up at the top of the bell curve, a little bit past the bell curve, up into what's called the high normal range, were 2 traits. One is the trait of agreeableness, and the other one is the trait of conscientiousness. And that our personality impacts how we think about people that are very disordered, and how we have optimism and hope for their ability to change. And so personality, we bring our personality into these relationships. And it matters what our personality mixture is in terms of the amounts of certain traits. If we have too much of one thing or not enough of another, not to the extent of a personality disorder, but just within that normal range. And I don't know that we ever thought about what just having a little too much of something in the normal range could do in a relationship until we began to test you. And so our personalities, impact how we think, including what we think in these relationships. And when things are happening and the relationship dynamics are being crazy, and there's gaslighting and abuse, that our personality impacts how we think about that. And obviously what we think about that and how we read that and what our takeaway with that is impacts our behavior and what we decide to do or what we decide we're not going to do, like leaving. So, personality is important, because it impacts how we think in the relationship, our emotions, what we feel, how we interrelate, even in a pathological and very disordered relationship, and consequently what that does to the behavior. And so, in my mind, the issue about early childhood and whether this is codependency or trauma repetition on the survivor's part is important, and that all should be considered. But it's not the totality of the answer of why this stuff happened, because over 60% of you guys did not have the aversive childhood. So it can't be that. It had to be something everybody has, which is a personality. So anyway, these 2 trait elevations, and I'm just going to read right out of the book because I'm bound to forget something if I don't. So this is in, let's see, the chapter 12. It's called The Super Traits of the Survivor Partner, Agreeableness, the Relationship Investment Trait. So this trait is called agreeableness. And the other test that we did years ago, over a decade ago, using the TCI, it was described as cooperativeness. And of course, those two are very, very similar, that the partner has a little bit more than past the bell curve in high normal amounts of this trait of agreeableness. And these facets that make up this trait, we have nicknamed the relationship investment trait. This agreeableness is all about all the facets that make the survivor really love and invest in relationships. It's important to them emotionally, but how they're hardwired in their personality naturally. So as I read these facets that make up the trait, you don't pick and choose. I have this facet, I don't have that facet. All these facets are there that make up the trait of agreeableness. So as I read this list, think about them in terms of how these facets interplay and make a survivor very relationship oriented. And it's what makes people love you, is that you are so relationship invested, not just, in your intimate relationships, but in all relationships. You're probably a great friend, a great co-worker, all of that, because you're naturally wired to be invested in relationships. Okay, so the facets that make up this trait of agreeableness include high normal amounts of trust, that you are very naturally and not necessarily because you were abused as a child. Remember, not all of you had childhood abuse, but all of you had high normal trust that came from your personality. So it doesn't matter whether or not, it's not just coming from if you had an aversive childhood. So you have a high normal, little past the bell curve, amount of trust, which means you are naturally trusting of others and that you are trustworthy. And most importantly, let's think about this with the relationship, the pathological relationship. You are naturally optimistic about human nature. So when, people wonder why the hell you even thought that this person could change, and that you were naive, or that you were a doormat, or that you were codependent, and that's why you believed that there could be change, or kept sending them to counseling or her to counseling. It has more to do that in your personality, you are hardwired to be optimistic about human nature. And so in your everyday life with normal people, that's not a problem. That's like grace and mercy. That's like a gift of grace and mercy. But in the hands of an antagonistic and pathological individual, to have this trait elevation and optimism about human nature becomes a risk factor for you in the future, but only with them. The interesting thing that Purdue said is that these trait elevations up in the high normal range don't appear to have been a problem anywhere. These are not bad traits. These are beautiful traits. These are what have made you the warm, loving person that you are, that people love about you. And Purdue said the only places could possibly work against them and go wrong is in, relationships with people who have low conscience and who are manipulative and antagonistic by their hardwiring and their personality. And so in this facet, of trust, that you are naturally trusting of others and you are trustworthy, and that you have optimism about human nature, and that you automatically tend to see others through who you are. And that's bad, because it's almost like an issue of projection, that because you're trusting and trustworthy, you think the world out there is mostly like you. And maybe that's true, but again, the only place this is problematic is when you begin seeing and assuming and assigning traits to pathological people they don't have. So as you get those red flags and the intel, that the information is coming in, it is met, by your personality that wants to reconfigure that information. That red flag you saw, you are, if he does have that, you're optimistic he can change it. Or you see it and then you say I'm probably over exaggerating. He's probably like me. Most people are like me. And the truth of the matter is, we all have different personality makeups. Everybody isn't like you. And that does become, a risk factor in the future, that your default mechanism in your personality, we don't even have to think about our personality. It just does what it's wired to do. And our default mechanism in that issue of trust is to naturally be optimistic and to naturally want to see other people through who you are. And so the work with survivors, after they trauma reduce, is having to work with and become conscious and mindful of personality that we never think of. We just don't, unless we had some really outstanding part of our personality before the pathological relationship. Like if we were horribly shy, we might be aware of that part of our personality. But when our personality has not caused us problems in the past, and that we get along, with most people, nobody pays attention to their personality. It's just who you are and what you do and how you think and feel and relate and behave. And so when someone has the personality that we believe is targeted, then that personality, becomes a risk factor in the future that they have to deeply work with. And it's not enough for them to go and get trauma treatment and make their symptoms go away, because this risk factor is going with them back out there, back into partner selection mode, back into where 1 in 5 people has a personality disorder and 1 in 100 people have reduced conscience. And so that's, to us, where our second step work has been, and what we're trying to teach therapists about. They know how to treat trauma, but they don't know is about, you can work with them with codependency until the cows come home. And if they really aren't one of the 30-some% that might have codependency on top of the super traits, you're not helping them at all. We're not getting to the issue of prevention and mindful awareness of these traits in action. We call it having to chaperone our super traits, paying attention when we meet people that we automatically want to trust. And so, survivors that have this high normal level of trust have what we call blind trust. And so that trait just wants to, unchaperoned, go to its default, its computer default, and trust. And so in that, they tend to give people a lot of chances. So if all of our trust was like a credit card, when they meet someone, they give them their credit card, carte blanche. Here's my trust, and I will trust you until you violate it. And then I might reconsider. That's called blind trust. And the reason it's a problem is there's another trait we're going to look at that has to do with tolerance. And so when this person violates their trust, they have so much tolerance that it takes a lot more times of violating to get to their saturation point in tolerance. This is how all these facets and why survivors need work and they need understanding on, because these traits work together in good ways with normal people and in bad ways with pathological people. So while you know, this issue of trust, this blind trust, maybe she finally gets the red flag about this issue of trust, but now it's dealing with how she's hardwired to feel about tolerance. Now it's got to get over that hurdle, and then all the other facet hurdles that all work together. And so survivors and their natural personality, not being chaperoned, not chaperoning their trust, will default to naturally giving blind trust. So with people who have not high normal in this trait of agreeableness and the facet of trust, when they're more in the middle of the bell curve, they tend to have conditional trust, which is, I don't know you from Adam, and you're going to earn my trust. And when you break trust, the relationship is broken. So that's how people who don't have high normal agreeableness looks at it. And I'm sure that you have had friends or family that don't have high normal agreeableness in this blind trust that has looked at you and said, why do you trust this person? You don't even know them. They need to earn the trust. You need to see consistency over time. That's not how you think about trust when you have high normal agreeableness. And so other people are looking at you thinking, like, that's crazy. That's just completely crazy that she just assumes people are like her, and here's all my trust, and then show me if there's a problem with that. And so, so that's the facet of trust in this issue of agreeableness that we call is the relationship investment personality trait, that we need trust, you know, in order to have a relationship and a healthy relationship. But their issue is they have too much trust. And the thing about personality is that when I began looking at this decades ago, there wasn't the research out there that there was. I mean, I was flying blind trying to figure this out. And looking at personality research, there was tons of research on personality disorders and what that was like. But there wasn't personality, you know, studies on too much of other types of traits that are not the traits that are too high in personality disorders. So, you know, we didn't have a lot of information on high trust. It's only been, you know, in the last 10 or 15 years where they've begun testing other elements of personality traits that are too high or too low other than personality disorders. And so I had no information about this issue about hypertrust, high trust, except my consistent experience with hundreds of clients. And so, but now we have where these personality assessments are beginning to test things that are a little bit over the bell curve, like you guys, and what that can, is there a downside to that? And of course, the only downside to having too much trust is if you put it in someone who is malignantly distrustful. Otherwise, probably in the other parts of your life with normal people, it might not be the best approach, but it probably hasn't bit you in the ass. And until that, you know, too much trust met up with a pathological disorder. And so we didn't have a whole lot of information on what a little too much of a trait meant. We only had the information on a lot too much of a trait, which would have been a personality disorder, or a lot of not enough of a trait that would have been a personality disorder. We had no information about just a little one toe over the line into this high normal, you know, aspect. And so I just kept seeing this issue of this high elevated blind trust that was very different than conditional trust that most people operate out of. So I'm talking a whole lot, and I can see by all the traits that are still, or facets that are left in this trait, I'm not going to get all the way through it. So you're going to have to come back. I'm going to do one more. I don't like to let these videos go too long, because then they're hard to upload and people get bored and whatever. All right, so I'm going to do one more, and then you're just going to have to come back or go to Safe Relationships magazine and listen to the audios on it. So the next facet that makes up the trait of agreeableness, and again, you don't pick and choose, these are all part that weave together that make the trait of agreeableness, that makes you very relationship invested, and that you find a lot of great joy and satisfaction in your relationships when they work and when they are healthy. Girlfriends, colleagues, intimates, all of it. So the next trait is called straightforwardness. And it means that you are very upfront. And so when I ran, back in the day, when I ran groups for psychopaths that had been usually court ordered into a program, they would talk about this issue of finding people who were very upfront, and that if someone asks you a question, you're just no BS. You just tell it like it is. Your life is an open book, and you're just very upfront about whatever it is they want to know. Well, of course, they're digging for gold, because they're going to take, you know, all that information about yourself and mirror and parrot it back in order to create the image for you to enter this relationship. And so the psychopaths in the group talked about this, about testing out this trait of straightforwardness early in the relationship, because they didn't want to stay and invest longer if they weren't able to get that information. And so and this is applicable to narcissists too. This just happened to be this group with court-ordered psychopaths. So imagine other people that don't understand this about you, your family, your friends, a therapist that sees this straightforwardness and this upfrontness that looks like a trait of over-disclosure, over-disclosing. I call it verbal bulimia, where people just puke their personal histories. And it looks like boundary issues. And it's why therapists have probably sent you to boundary groups over and over again about this trait of straightforwardness and being so upfront that you don't know to withhold, you know, information that someone is trying to get from you. Again, your default mechanism in your personality is just to be straightforward. You would have to chaperone yourself in order to not be upfront and confiding, and and honest about your history that somebody else might be trying to mine the information for the wrong type of purposes. So we can see both how these facets of being in a high normal range, how they apply to exactly what happened in the early stages of how you got in the relationship, what these facets acted like in the relationship, and how these facets probably produce difficulty and disengagement. So we can see that this is like really important stuff to understanding the whole relationship dynamic. That's why I built the theory of these relationship dynamics from what I came to know about the survivors, and it's all connected. The relationship dynamics are not just about his personality. It's also about her personality, and this is what, or his personality, is about. And so the other thing I think that we should also keep in mind as we're looking at this research and this understanding of the traits is what someone on the outside would be thinking when they saw this presentation of, just for example, trusting of others, optimistic about human nature, see others through who she is. That can look like naivety. And so again, if I didn't have my clientele base to fall back on, that, you know, is a judge really naive? Is a surgeon really naive? I mean, I had a reality test against that because I wanted to think the same thing. That kind of trust must be some kind of Pollyanna kind of thinking. And I had to keep going back to what I knew about the survivors and their personality, and that they weren't dependent, and they weren't naive, and they weren't gullible. But when you're looking at somebody on the outside, you know, that's looking at these traits in action, you know, in this very damaging and dangerous relationship, and they see trusting and optimism, and seeing others through who they are, and being straightforward and upfront and honest and confiding. And, you know, part of that is connected to confiding. She wouldn't be confiding if she didn't have high trust and already be optimistic and already think that person is okay. That's how these, facets are interrelated. But somebody looking at these facets in action are going to misread that and misdiagnose it because they're not thinking about it in hardwired personality. They're thinking about it in nurture theory. What happened to them that made them like that? Nothing. They came into the world wired like that. Well, 30-some%, might have had some of that. But that's, everyone's trained to automatically default to this nurture theory. And while I was trauma trained, as a trauma therapist, which is very nurture theory based, my primary and earliest training was in personality, which is nature, and how my brain tends to think first. And so the automatic thinking, especially when they have gone to therapists, is therapists automatically think that this is nurture issues. They automatically then assume that aversive early childhood. And if there's an aversive early childhood, then there's probably codependency or dependency. And so we can see that this is a chain reaction of assumptions. And why survivors, have been sent to, codependency groups or diagnosed. You can't really diagnose them codependent because it's not a diagnosis. Labeled that, or that it later when we get into some more of the relationship, the facets that are related to the relationship dynamics, how those can be, misconstrued by therapists, and why they can get diagnosed dependent personality disorder or codependent or relationship addicted or sex addicts. I mean, I've seen all of that. And I had my own early, thoughts that went down the same path. And if it wasn't, for that consistent presentation in these survivors, I probably would have came to those chain reaction kinds of assumptions that this behavior must have come from this childhood, which means they are this. And thank God, it was a lot of years, but thank God my survivors were so convincing and so consistent and so resilient and so strong, and these traits were beautiful traits that made them successful, that these were not people that were, low functioning people. It was such a different kind of presentation that I stayed firm in my belief from what I had seen in these survivors, that a lot of the stuff that they were being labeled with, there was a better explanation for it. And the secrets of it were probably in their personality. So we're going to stop right there because I'm long-winded and I need to get shorter on these. And so we've got, those were 2 facets of agreeableness, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. So I promise next time I'm going to try to talk quicker, because you can go to Safe Relationships magazine, to the audio on the right-hand side of the page that says Super Traits of Personality, and listen to it in more detail, or in the book. And next time I'll try to be shorter winded. So for those that are bloggers on the topic, I'm asking for professionalism here, that this is theory, copyrighted theory. Please cite your source. We're happy to share this information with you, to allow you into, you know, other kinds of trainings on this, to utilize these YouTubes, to utilize the audio, as long as you are citing the source that has spent decades doing this and produced, you know, the research on it. So thank you for learning how to cite. It's important. All right, so I'm going to wind it up there, and we'll pick up next time. So this has been Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.